Morning, Expo. Maybe we'll start funneling in here in a second. I guess you're okay, everyone. Okay, it's just me. So, I'm Josh Evans. I'm with the Equipment Dealers Association, and I'm going to give you a little bit about what's going on with the government. It's fitting that I'm after Bob's presentation. The only thing I would disagree with what he said is the bottom number is not your profit. The bottom number at the back of that income statement is what you got to pay the government. So coming right after that, and we're going to talk about the government for a little bit. There's a lot going on for equipment dealers at the state level, but I promise you this isn't all going to be about right to repair. So we're going to talk about that. Front and center for dealers, when we talk about parts and services, it's going to be right to repair, what we call legal tampering legislation. The crux of it is there are advocates out there that are swooping up equipment dealers, and those dealers, what they're trying to get is a system where equipment dealers are on the same playing field as the end user. So those deals you get by being authorized dealers of John Deere, Case and Holland, what they want is the same pricing in terms that you get for everybody. Even though they don't have the trained technicians, they don't have the expertise, they don't have the relationship with the manufacturer. So at the Equipment Dealers Association, we are monitoring this nationwide, and we're also monitoring at the federal level, which we'll get into. But what you see here on this slide is our 2021 legislative activity for the right to repair movement. The bills we've seen across the country. So far, our side, we're 27-0, meaning we haven't had any of these bills passed. There has not been an agricultural bill passed that's going to affect the dealer so far. But what we're seeing in this movement is more bills being introduced, more advocates coming forward, and so we have to keep up our efforts on the other side. Right now, if you look at that slide, you'll see that we're actively monitoring bills in the Northeast. And what you won't see on that slide is there's also a federal bill introduced in Washington, D.C., sitting around at the Energy and Commerce Committee. We'll talk about that in a minute. But that's the scope of it. So if you're in a state that you feel, hey, you know, my state's, they back dealers, we're a conservative state, or, you know, we feel that we've got a good rapport with our legislators, you should know that there is no such thing as a safe state anymore for this right to repair legislation. What we should be calling legal tampering legislation, because that's what the end of it's going to be. So, it's across the country. And what we expect next cycle, so January 1, and throughout 2022, is that map will be filled up with right to repair bills being introduced. So it doesn't matter where you're at in the country. You're going to be affected by this legislation. And going back to Bob's presentation, it affects your bottom line. And so that, the equipment dealers, is what we're trying to protect. So, what's going on a, that's the macro level. Let's look at the micro. For right to repair legislation, we're seeing in Missouri ballot initiatives that are being funded by advocates from New York. So what of that is Missouri, the state, they're a very ballot initiative heavy state. They're having a hard time passing it through the legislature. So what they're going to do to try to pass this legislation is go in through a ballot initiative. And if you've ever read a ballot initiative, it can be very deceiving, right? They could frame it as, customer choice. That's usually how they frame it. And who's going to say, well, no, I don't want customers to have choice, right? So that's what we're up against in Missouri, and we're certainly monitoring that situation. Repair.org and other right to repair advocates, they're receiving significant fundraising. There was an advocate in New York I just mentioned. He received over $750,000 in a span of 4 or 5 weeks, putting up a GoFundMe account. And you look at the donations, these aren't $10, $15, $20, $25 donations. He's getting $25,000 a pop, so you know it's not a grassroots effort, the way they'd like you to believe. This is a concerted effort, it's organized, and they're using folks that are what you would deem a local person or like a better story person than the folks that really want this. So that's what we're doing. We're organizing dealers across the country. We're getting dealers interested and advocating for their own behalf to fight this legislation and hopefully introduce legislation that's going to be beneficial to the dealers down the road. So in our efforts to combat this, we've been in New York, we've been in Massachusetts, we're monitoring Rhode Island, Connecticut, Pennsylvania, and then I mentioned the federal bill. But as an update, New York, this past cycle, passed a right to repair bill out of the Senate. And so far, it's not passed in the Assembly, and that's what we're advocating to stop that. Rhode Island, we've been monitoring, we've been having meetings in Pennsylvania, we're meeting with the farm bureaus in Maryland, trying to work out a solution that's going to benefit the dealers and help the farmers out that are concerned. So that's right to repair. This is not going away. And what we're hoping to do is raise the awareness to dealers, because I can come in as a lobbyist and talk to state representatives, senators, Congress folks, federal senators, and I might be able to frame the issue, but until we put a human face on it, until the dealer shows up and says, hey, I'm in your district, right now I'm paying 10 people that are in your district. There's 25 mouths I'm feeding through my dealership. That local representative, congressman, senator, doesn't have the same, it has a better impact than if Josh Evans comes in and says, hey, this is going to impact my dealers. So I would urge you as the dealer to get involved if you're not already involved. And we certainly at the EDA have developed a toolkit to help you become an advocate for yourself in combating this right to repair legislation. And you can certainly use it for other purposes as well, because it just basically shows you step by step how you would contact your representative, how you would set up that meeting, hosting them at your dealership, training your sales folks and your service reps on the way, using the right verbiage. So these right to repair advocates don't call up your dealership and say, hey, we want this service manual, or we want this diagnostic tool, and you have some, the lowest level of your dealership says, well, you can't get that. That's dealer service advisor. When there's customer service advisor available, and you're a dealer. So we're putting that out there. We're hoping you pick it up as the dealer, and we're hoping that you can help us combat this legislation that's going to affect your bottom line, which is all about the last presentation. So right to repair is a top priority for the EDA, but there are other things out there that we're keeping an eye on, and this is a 2021 legislative affairs presentation, so I don't want to take up all my time talking about right to repair, but as a dealership, this should be your top priority in terms of legislative affairs, because it is a direct impact to your dealership, the way these laws are written. And just so that you understand the other side of it, what they're trying to say is dealers, Case, Kubota, and Holland, John Deere, and the manufacturers are preventing customers from repairing their own equipment. Well, you know that's false, right? Because 60% of your sales are parts over the counter, and the customer's either putting them on or having someone else, put these parts on. So it's very important, and I'm going to stress this at the very end. It's very important that you get engaged in this issue, because your voice is the voice that matters most to your representative, and your voice is the one that's going to prevent these types of bills with these unintended consequences from passing. So that's right to repair in a nutshell, high-level view of what's going on with this type of legislation. And the EDA is going to continue to monitor it. If you're not a member of the EDA, or if you don't know, come see us at the booth back there, because we want to talk to you more about this issue, give you tools and resources to combat this in your state and region. I mentioned the federal bill. We're fighting a bill in New York, a right to repair, a legal tampering bill. The same case. New York assembly person became a congressman, so now we have a federal bill, which would affect all 50 states. It's currently sitting in a committee. There's been little movement so far, and we're hoping in the future that that bill dies. I covered right to repair in like 10 minutes, and I promised myself I wouldn't talk more about that, because there's other things going on in the federal government that you need to know about. If anyone's been following the news, you've probably seen this back and forth between Democrats and Republicans on COVID, what the impacts are going to be to your business. So just last week, OSHA sent a temporary standard to the White House. So you probably remember a couple months ago, President Biden came out and said, hey, not enough people are getting vaccinated, is what he said. And because of that, if you're an employer with over 100 employees, I'm directing OSHA to create a standard so you have to either have 100% compliance or do weekly testing. You have 7 days OSHA to promulgate this rule. Well, OSHA didn't do it in 7 days. It took them like 43, 50 days. But as of October 12th, OSHA sends this emergency temporary standard to the White House, which will consist of what Biden directed them to do. You've probably seen in the news some major airlines said, hey, listen, we're not going to do this. Some other major retailers said, we can't do this. And that remains to be seen whether they're going to do it or not. But it's important for us to keep monitoring this, because if your dealership has 100 or more employees, you can be swept up in this mandate. You might say to yourself, well, my state governor has said he's going to challenge this mandate. That puts you in a precarious situation, because you're going to say, I'm going to comply with the state regulation and ignore OSHA to my own peril. We're going to continue to monitor that EDA, and we'll give our members updates as to what the legal ramifications are, the challenges, and where this all sits when it comes out. But as it stands right now, if you've got 100 employees or more, you don't have a vaccine mandate in place. President Biden coming out and saying so, hey, this is what we're doing, does not make it law. So I would expect that the OSHA draft emergency temporary standard is going to come back from the White House to OSHA, and then OSHA will publish it. We'll give it a couple days, and then 60 days after they publish it, it could become effective. So if you're a dealer with under 100 employees, this won't affect you, most likely. We've not seen the final draft of this. This could be changed by the President of the White House, or come back to OSHA and they can change it. This is something you should be wary of. You should be very alert of if you're in that 100 dealer mark, 100 employee mark at your dealership. Well, if we can wait to questions to the end, that'd be great. With regard to enforcement, we would expect them to start enforcing it sometime, probably the end of November, December, and it very well might not have real enforcement until 2022. And God willing, this whole COVID thing will have passed, but since we've been dealing with 2 years, I don't know if we're going to get through it anytime soon. I'm certainly not a doctor or scientist that could make that. But essentially, this is how it becomes law of the land for OSHA. There are nuances in OSHA laws depending on your state and how your state incorporates OSHA mandates. And that's something that we could talk about later at the booth. It's a bit more nuanced for a 50-state legislation discussion. So that's something we're monitoring at the EDA. If you've been watching the news, you've seen this Build Back Better plan from President Biden, and it's $3.5 trillion. Sorry about that. At least the plan started at $3.5 trillion. And if you watch the news last night, you saw President Biden indicate, hey, listen, fellow Democrats, we got to walk back this $3.5 trillion because we can't even get all the Democrats on board with that. So now they're talking about $1 trillion. This is pretty recent news. So when they create this spending, this infrastructure plan, which we'll talk about in a second, this 3.5, what they call human infrastructure plan, they've got to have a way to pay for it. So what you've seen floated, and again this kind of ties back to the last presentation, is how are we going to pay for this? So what congressional Democrats have proposed is increasing corporate tax rates from 21 to 26%, as high as 28%. What they propose is increasing the federal top tax rate, increasing that by 2.5% to pay for this spending, and then obviously changing capital gains from 20 to 25%. For folks that are larger dealers that have that corporate formality, that would obviously be a big increase in terms of your bottom line and your tax bill. That's the current discussion of increasing tax revenue to pay for the $3.5 trillion. Now, if they reduce the spend, obviously there's less need to make it revenue neutral, so those rates could fluctuate. But that's what's currently being discussed by House and Senate Democrats to pay for the $3.5 trillion spend. There's discussion. It's one thing to raise taxes, tax rates. There's another discussion about changing the way we do the estate planning tax. And those discussions, they're more nuanced and they get less coverage because they're harder to explain. When you talk about grants and trusts and annuity trusts, it's kind of hard for people to wrap their minds around. But essentially, another pay for that we're discussing is taking away exemptions that regular folks have to transition businesses from one generation to the next. And so the EDA were opposed to those changes, especially the estate tax changes. Another way they're going to try to pay for this is IRS enforcement. There was a provision that actually just got walked back, talking about changing the way banks, financial institutions would have to report. So the idea was if you had a bank account and there was $600 or more in it, the bank would have to send the IRS that transaction report. So every money coming in, money coming out, and that's the way they were going to catch tax cheats, or at least that was the idea. The banks threw a fit and they walked that proposal back. So again, no bill is final. They could always put it back in the bill. But right now, at first reading, they removed it. Well, when I wrote this, I was foreshadowing something that looks like it's going to happen. It won't be a $3.5 trillion spend. They've already started walking that back. There's moderate Democrats or conservative Democrats, depending on where you sit, that are saying they're not going to support it. Progressive Democrats say they don't want to support anything less. President Biden is struggling to get this thing off the ground, so he's telling everyone, let's try to do something less. And that's where we're getting that discussion of $1 trillion spend. Last report, there are so many Republicans against this, there's not getting any traction from the other side. And to get something this momentum, this large path, there's going to have to be some bipartisan support. So when you hear this Build Back Better plan and things like that, you don't see parts of it that Republicans can jump onto. The idea of it getting passed, in my humble opinion, gets smaller and smaller the closer we get to 2022. So, like I said, unless there's serious movement soon from Democrats coalescing around a plan, it seems unlikely, in my opinion, that it's going to pass. But if it does, there's going to have to be pay-fors, like I should. Yeah, there's going to have to be pay-fors in that bill. So what are we looking at in terms of the pay-fors? That remains to be seen. But this corporate tax increase, that's at the top of the list. Infrastructure bill. So some folks are getting this confused. There's the Build Back Better plan, which is like $3.5 trillion, which was initially proposed, and then there's the infrastructure bill. You remember it got passed in the Senate a couple months ago, and we're still like waiting for the House to pick it up. So what's in the infrastructure bill? It's about $550 billion in new federal spending. Great. Roads, bridges, infrastructure, we need that. The helps of it, I'll let you read that, but essentially what we're talking about is pay-fors. The components of the act, when you break down that new spending, we're getting about $100 billion on roads and bridges, 60 on passenger freight, other core infrastructure projects. I like to put the net cost in there. So the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, they examine bills and they figure out, well, how much is this going to cost us? And this is the number they figure it's going to cost us. There's obviously concerns in any legislation that we want to look at. This infrastructure bill is no different. Again, it passed the Senate. It's in the House right now. It can be changed and sent back to the Senate. But the Buy America policy, requirements of forcing prevailing wage, significant rail funding despite rail funding being a fraction of the infrastructure need. And for us, I think this is, equipment dealers, we should really learn about the Highway Transportation Fund or Highway Trust Fund. There's structural problems within this fund that limits the money going to rural areas where a lot of dealers are at the expense or to the benefit of high-density areas. And so the so what of that is more of our money that we're going to spend on infrastructure is going to go to metropolitan areas as opposed to rural areas where we need the infrastructure. Sure, in your rural communities you've got plenty of potholes, but we need those potholes fixed because that causes machine breakdowns. So this is something of a debate. The National Motor Vehicle Per Mile User Fee. In the bill, there was a pilot program where you could volunteer to be part of this. It's talking about like a per mile fee because they're having a hard time structuring the gasoline tax, and they're trying to cure that. And one of the proposals is to have like a user-based fee where if you drive a lot, you can pay more taxes than someone who drives less. It is not, and I should be very clear on it, does not actually create a per mile tax. But it's a pilot program to determine whether that would be good or not. So that is in the bill, and that's a concern. Buy America policy sounds great. It's like the term right to repair. It sounds like, hey, that's a great, we should all support that. Until you dive into what it does, and it basically removes choice for contractors. Well, and it also does this, creates a new position within the federal government. So we're creating, I guess, a federal job on top of that. Largely what it does, though, the frustration for contractors, it creates a lot of red tape in terms of sourcing in an environment where we're already having sourcing problems. Prevailing wage, I think most folks know prevailing wage requirements and the problems with that. The Highway Trust Fund, we talked about that. One of the biggest structural problems we just talked about with regard to how they implement the Highway Trust Fund, 20% is going to the Highway Trust Fund. It has a deficit that we're basically putting $90 million into to fix. So of that, $500 billion of new spending, we're losing a quarter of it to just basically make this thing solvent. So it's not truly new spending. I go into a little bit of detail about the Highway Trust Fund and how they do it, how they fund it. 82% of its funding comes from the gas tax. We talked about the per mile tax, that the pilot program on the per mile tax. What they're trying to do is make that solvent and replace some of that federal gas tax. Again, that might be more of an opinion from me. Some people would argue against that, but I believe that the Highway Trust Fund is essentially a benefit to metropolitan areas at the expense of rural infrastructure networks. All right, that's the actual payments set out in the state appropriations, and you can see, where's California? So you can see that the dollar return California is getting. It's about 9.3% compared to, let's look at Alabama, 1.9%. In terms of population density and such, that's why it hurts those other less populated areas. So we talked about the per mile tax. That's our concern, right? As folks that drive a lot, that have to service folks, we're certainly against a per mile tax. We feel like we already paid at the pump and we have to fill up our gasoline and impose the tax on that. All right, so that is the infrastructure plan. I just want to go into briefly how this is all playing out in Congress. So you've got on the left Democrats who are saying, we're not going to pass the infrastructure. These are House Democrats. We're not passing the Senate-passed infrastructure bill unless you also give us the Build Back Better plan, the $3.5 trillion spend. So this infrastructure bill, which is separate than the $3.5 trillion spend, has come up or was scheduled to be voted on 3 times now, and each time it's been pulled right before the vote by Speaker Pelosi. Why? She didn't have the votes to pass it. And the reason she didn't have the votes to pass it is because on the left, they're saying, we want them both passed, otherwise we pass your infrastructure bill, we're never going to get our Build Back Better plan spent. And so it's a stalemate right now. So a largely beneficial bill for the country, the infrastructure bill, is also being held up by this $3.5 trillion spend. If you watch the news at all, there's no bipartisan agreement in sight in terms of this. So President Biden's trying to coalesce Democrats together to reduce the spend and hopefully get this infrastructure bill passed and some component of this Build Back Better plan passed coming into 2022. For dealers, shifting away from really partisan issues to something that should be a very bipartisan issue. The RETAIN Act is something the Equipment Dealers Association is really behind. There is a spectrum that we use in our GPS guided equipment precision ag that may be affected by a company that purchased an adjacent spectrum. So we're talking GPS. So we're pushing a piece of legislation that if that spectrum is affected, if your equipment goes down because the spectrum gets used in such a way that your GPS data is affected and your ag equipment goes from precision to not so precise, that company would have to pay you the damages. Right now, the law isn't protecting you, it's protecting the Department of Defense and other types of federal agencies that use this GPS equipment. And what we're asking for is Congress to support a specific bill that would protect you, commercial users of GPS. And we're going to need that commercial GPS spectrum until we've got broadband through all 50 states and we can have enough link and downlink through that. So that is the GPS data and privacy component of what we're doing at the Equipment Dealers Association. I intentionally breezed through this in hopes that there'd be some questions. I saw there was one in the back. Yeah.
It was back to 100 employees for the OSHA thing. Is that 100 employed there or working in the same facility?
Are you talking, when you say 100 working in the same facility, are you saying that multiple companies are set up working in the same facility?
Well, that possibly, but then also like there's 100 employees, but 40 of them like work on the field. They're not at this.
But it's for the same company?
Yeah.
Yeah. They would be included within that for the same company.
If they were different companies, they wouldn't.
Yeah, right. So the way that OSHA would look at it is they would look at your payroll for the company. And it can get finicky. So if you think seasonal employees, it depends on when they'd be looking. So it's if it were me, and I put my lawyer hat on it, if I'm even close to that 100 mark, if I'm 95 employees and I've got seasonal folks, this is something I would be considered. Now, mind you, this is not the law, this is not the lay of the land yet, and there could be changes to this draft. So what I would suggest, if I was close to that threshold, I would begin preparing. And I would begin preparing by determining how many of my employees have been vaccinated and unvaccinated in a confidential way, using your human resources, whatever department, whoever that person is. I would find that information out. And then once you find that information out, well, you can determine, do I have a problem or not? If 80% of my employees are unvaccinated, well, I'm going to have a heck of a lot of testing going on. There's provisions in this emergency temporary standard that essentially require the the employer to provide paid time off for the employee to go get tested and to go get the vaccination if the employee wants. And then part of this regulation is going to be if the employee has an adverse reaction to the vaccine, the employer will have to have paid time off for that. So there's going to be a whole lot of, frankly, litigation if this goes through, because, you know, they're putting out this regulation, but the details are kind of murky, and they butt up against existing employment law. So in your situation, wherever these employees are, if there's 100 of them, or you're close to that threshold, you've got seasonal and contractors, I would begin planning for that. Now, I will say that there are large, we were talking last night at dinner, you know, Southwest Airlines and other larger corporations have said, you know, we're not doing this, government. We can't do it. It's unworkable for us. So thinking through that, and knowing that there are states out there that are going to challenge this in court, that are vehemently against this, because of the practical implications for, you know, mid-sized companies, we don't know how it's going to shake out. But I think it's very well worth your time to think logistically how we would implement this if we're going to implement it. And the Equipment Dealers Association, we've created templates for dealers to basically help them, you know, guide them through this process as we learn more, right? This part of my job is reading the tea leaves, and the other part is, once it's set in stone, let's figure out how we limit dealers' exposure. Yes, ma'am.
Is the 100 employees, if they just look at payroll, so it doesn't matter if they're part-time, full-time?
So that's a great, so the question was, do they look at part-time and full-time? I would err on the side of they would look at both. If you're close to that threshold, the way that I'm reading tea leaves at this point, because they've not produced the final, right? Reading the tea leaves, they're going to look at part-time and full-time because their goal is forcing you into getting your employees vaccinated. There are certain laws, if you know, the Fair Labor Standards Act, there are certain laws where they've got exemptions and carve-outs and things. I don't think this regulation is going to be one that there's many exemptions and carve-outs, unless big corporate America raises a stink, and that's kind of started. But in terms of this OSHA directive, this emergency temporary standard going into effect, I'm again reading tea leaves, but it's not going to differentiate. It's going to look at number of employees on payroll. Are you at that 100 threshold? The real question that I have that we should be asking ourselves is contractors that are with another company on another company's payroll, are they going to count that towards your 100? That's the concern I have. When she talked about employees of different companies in the same facility, like that'll be where the legal fights come if OSHA tries to take a broad approach in terms of enforcing this. Yes, sir.
I got a couple things basically on that. I also work with a nonprofit, so we have a lot of volunteers coming in. So that question came up on volunteers, and you're right, the whole thing has got a lot of holes in it and a lot of questions. So we're kind of held back, waiting to see where things are going to go. But I had a question about the right to repair act, and it's been some time since I read up on that. For a very small, I've got a very small repair company, and we do not have a dealership under any brand and stuff like that. So I know we have had a lot of issues, mainly with the onset of the electronic fuel injection centers and the small actions where we are unable to test anything, and so that.
Do you deal with one brand more than another?
Not necessarily. I'm in a rural area, so
sure.
We get
Jack of all trades, kind of thing.
And it's to the point where I have to turn people away because I just can't do anything with it. And so that's one of the issues I have with that. But years ago, it opened that up a little bit, and I just don't know where they stand now.
So let me just repeat the question so everyone can kind of, I'm paraphrasing a little bit.
Sure.
So Ronald's got what I would call an independent repair shop. he works on all brands, and his question comes up quite a bit with legislators. Hey, what prevents a guy from going out and fixing this equipment if he wants to, repair John Deere in case, or Kubota, or what have you? And the answer is currently each major manufacturer has put out diagnostic equipment. It's harder on small equipment, right? You're talking like lawnmowers, yard equipment.
Anything these days.
Yeah. I mean, the equipment's getting more sophisticated. The way that we're making this equipment smarter is by going from analog to digital. And when you do that, you've got to have software. Or at least that's the way they're coming out with this. So up until 2019, I think that argument held more weight, but in 2019, Equipment Dealers Association, major manufacturers that came out, we put out this industry commitment that we were going to provide diagnostic repair equipment for the end user, including independent repair shops. And each major manufacturer has now produced some type of diagnostic equipment for the end user. So in terms of like your issue with regard to turning people away, it's an investment issue, right? If you invested in customer service advisor for John Deere, a lot of that repairs you can make is you would be able to pull up the code and see exactly what's wrong and order the part through the John Deere dealer, or whatever network you use. The same for Kubota, Case, and Holland. So as we sit right now, the right to repair legislation is unnecessary for this industry because we offered that diagnostic toolkit through these main lines. Now, there are some smaller manufacturers that have not produced diagnostic equipment, but the major manufacturers that have 90-something% of the market share, they produce this diagnostic equipment that's available to everybody. And some of it you have to pay for it, some of it's free online, but I mean, to your point, it sounds like you're doing repairs that require some sort of diagnostic tool. And you're doing it for 4 brands, it sounds like.
Right. Yeah, and it is kind of stifling to your business when, and obviously, people my age, they're long gone because you just can't afford to keep up with that. And I lived through the advent of OBD1, OBD2 on automotive, and I was kind of praying that we were going to be looking at that in the equipment industry, the small engine industry, and of course everyone fans off their own way, so it would be nice to see a little more working together on something like that. I guess my point on the whole thing.
Sure.
Yeah, the little guys are pretty much going away because of this, and some of the bigger companies suffer from it. You don't have the repair centers and stuff like we did in the past.
Yeah, and a lot of this is a confluence of many issues, right? So when I talk to legislators about this illegal tampering legislation, what some people call right to repair, sometimes we refer to it as right to repair, we're talking about sourcing issues. End users are angry because they can't repair their equipment. It's got nothing to do with the fact that someone's hiding the repair from them. It's just simply supply chain issues or lack of available techs, or their perception that it's taking too long, like in the last presentation. So the Equipment Dealers Association, independent techs certainly play a role, but in terms of turning away some of that equipment, because listen, I want to make the investment in the diagnostic repair kit for John Deere, whatever, or Case or Kubota, it still exists. It's still, you have the right to go out and purchase it. And I certainly sympathize with your point. Hey, listen, it's hard for me as a guy who's just going out, fixing all brands to meet that bottom line if I have to buy 5 different diagnostic tools. But that's what's currently offered. And there are free options. There are manuals and such, but in terms of a business decision, that's what's been presented. Did I answer your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess there's really no good answer to this. Nothing's ever really changed. But we're just going to see the dying off of small companies like that, and something that people are going to have to learn to do.
Sure.
So.
Any other questions? Sir?
Could you go over the class again? We just got here.
Come talk on my booth's right across. We'll go through the whole slideshow again.
How do we advocate and encourage our manufacturers from a dealer standpoint to be proactive in coming up with a compromise solution to the right repair? I think there's a couple of companies that have sparked this legislation more so than others, and you know, their arrogance, so to speak, in the marketplace has, you know, raised the level and really created a lot of this problem. How do we advocate with our manufacturers to kind of quell this and come up with a solution that serves the customers, the small independent shops, and the dealerships? You know, how do do you have any suggestions on how we as dealers push our manufacturers in that direction?
Sure, and I think the manufacturers are listening, because when I advocate with a legislator or a congressperson, they are there, and they're saying, listen, we're hearing what the world wants. They want a diagnostic tool. That exists now for major manufacturers. Whether it existed a couple of years ago, it's another story. But as we sit today, these major manufacturers, they've all put out end-user diagnostic toolkits, repair kits. What I think I see, though, in terms of advocating for the manufacturer, it's you, the dealer, coming to them and saying, hey, what can I, manufacturer, I know this exists. I want my customers to know I want you to repair your own equipment because I want to sell you a part, if nothing else. Support me in doing that. And then you're going to have your regional, salesperson that's going to, maybe he'll be scratching his head and have to go back and talk to somebody. Eventually it's going to get to someone that knows something of that manufacturer, if it's a major manufacturer. But I can tell you, my interactions with the, Kubota, Case, Collin, John Deere, these major manufacturers, they have teams of folks that are trying to figure this out, to fix the supply chain issue, to fix the sourcing issue. Because a lot of those issues get rolled up into this right to repair thing. When you talk to a farmer, at the end of the day, Bob's, they want their machine fixed, and they want it fixed yesterday. It's us getting out there that no one's preventing, in terms of diagnosing it, no one's stopping it. You have the right to diagnose your own equipment. We've got products available right now that will sell you, some of which are free, and you can diagnose your own equipment. So I think it's almost it's a PR issue, and I think it should start with the dealership. Because, in my opinion, the manufacturers, if right to repair gets passed in all 50 states, the manufacturers will just shift their business model. It's the dealer that's going to get impacted, and the dealer owns a local business. We as the dealers need to be telling our story to the customer and providing them the resources to repair their own equipment, because let's face it, you don't have the technician staff to fix every repair. You want some of those sales to be over the counter, and that's going to make your business profitable. But in terms of pushing back from the manufacturers, that's something that the EDA does on our members' behalf. Our CEO is standing in the background. He handles the manufacturer relations, so he's going to meetings with these manufacturers and explaining to them, this is my membership, some of which are independent repair folks, and these are the problems they're seeing with your brand. Some of it, we need to get out there ahead of this illegal tampering legislation, and we'll discuss that, and the EDA will put something out to our members to help the members, press the flesh, so to speak, and get that information out. So we want to be a resource for the members so they don't have to have those conversations with the manufacturer, because we can push on the manufacturer, and then you're an anonymous member, not, Benji, pushing back on who, you don't have to tell you your manufacturer, pushing back on your manufacturer, hey, we're not doing enough, let us do that for you. And that's kind of the EDA's role, is to be that intermediary between you and the manufacturer. And we're working on it. Right to repair right now is essentially my life. In terms of those red states, I'm going there several times in a month talking to legislators, having phone calls with legislators, trying to prevent this legislation, and just explaining to the legislators, hey, listen, we represent dealers and we want customers to fix their own stuff. We are totally on board with that because we're going to sell them the part. They're going to fix their uptime is the name of the game, and just explain to them that we are different than Apple. We're different than whoever makes TVs now, and we want this equipment to last decades. So getting that message out in a coherent way is kind of the most important thing, and that's why the EDA, we have created a toolkit. On the one hand, it focuses on advocating for yourself with legislators, and on the other hand, it produces some stock templates and things you can put in your dealership to help educate the customers, because it's really just an education issue, in my opinion. It's an education issue. The customers don't know that you're supporting the right to repair. They've got this perception because they see a news article about John Deere and, you know, preventing, or Case or whoever, preventing their customers from repairing on this specific issue, and they come into the dealership and they talk to some guy that's at the service counter who might not be as educated as he should be, and he says something that changes the customer's mind. So it's all of us getting on the same page and bringing a unified message against right to repair and providing those solutions that the Ronalds of the world need in terms of those independent repair diagnostic tools. But largely what we've seen in the industry is no one's asking for these diagnostic tools at the service and parts counter. And you talk to dealers, they might have 2 people that have called and asked, and 1 has bought it. But we have to make sure that everyone knows it's available, it's out there. And that's the messaging that the dealer can help us with. And certainly the relationship you have with your state representative, your congressman, your state senator, that's helpful as well. That's where we lean on our dealers. But in terms of the messaging, we've created a template toolkit that through you, we can push all this out. So if you're not a member in this room, we're across the hall and we'd love to talk to you about membership, how we get you involved, because ultimately we need to coalesce around this same message so we're all telling the same story, which is the true story, and we're getting that out in the public, and then eventually we will beat back this issue. Sure. My phone went off earlier, but I don't know how I'm on time. I'm getting the red light. I think I'm supposed to be done. So, I got time, I guess, for one more question if anyone has any. Sir?
Is there any push at all to create more standardization throughout the OEM industry? Somewhat similar to you see in the automotive industry with the leading boards and standard VIN codes across the industry and all that kind of stuff?
No, we've not seen that kind of goes back to his point on the diagnostic, yeah. No, we've not seen a unified, like one diagnostic tool in ag or heavy equipment. We've not seen that proposed from the manufacturer side.
Well, I'm sure it wouldn't come from there.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's no talk of that throughout the industry, that's where it needs to go to be standardized, similar to what we have in ours?
No, that's not something that we're discussing right now. I mean, in terms of like being proposed, that's not been proposed. And I think because these machines are varied in the line, the size, and the scope of it, in terms of creating like one diagnostic tool that fits them all, that's a discussion that, as this equipment becomes more evolved, maybe that enters the conversation. I think that's all the time I have. So if you guys have any more questions across the hall, thanks for coming in and thanks for learning about what's going on with your government as it relates to your dealership.